Welcome back to another Lightroom tutorial. This is going to be the beginning of a Tuesday tutorial series, so if that's something you'd be into, consider subscribing. Alright, let's jump into Lightroom. Alright, so we're going to be editing this photo of a deer I took while at the beach in Florida. And a lot of inspiration from this photo came from WithLuke. So if you're familiar with him, you know that a lot of his photos have like a soft look to them, a little bit of fade, not a lot of harsh whites. Very cinematic looking. So we're going to be going for more of a softer feel like this, with the muted colors, but still have some vibrancy to them. So in this photo you can see there's not a lot of harsh whites. The greens are muted, and overall the photo just looks pretty soft, but still retain a lot of detail in the deer itself. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing I'm going to do is just reset this photo. So this is what it looks like completely raw straight out the camera. So the first thing I like to do is crop the image. And for this one, I'm just going to play around with the rule of thirds by basically just putting the deer's head around this first third right here. So I think something like that looks pretty good. The photo looks pretty straight. There we go. And then I'm just going to work my way from basic all the way down, starting from the top. So the exposure in this photo, I think looks pretty good. The contrast we're going to do in the tone curve. The highlights, I'm just going to bring down just to see if we can get a little bit more detail in the sky and in the deer itself. So I'll bring it down maybe around to like 33, where we can see a little bit more detail back here. But nothing too crazy. For the shadows, we'll work with those in the tone curve. So moving down to the presence, I'm actually going to come back to this a little bit later in the photo. This might be one of the last things I do right before I add masking. So let's go ahead and move to the tone curve. So to get the faded look, what we're going to do is we're going to take the bottom of this tone curve and just slide it up to maybe somewhere around 16. And you can see down here at the bottom what that's going to do is just add a little bit of fade to those shadows. So we'll start with around 16 for now, and then we're going to add a point right about here, which is going to be our shadows, and we're going to bring those down just a little bit. And then we can kind of play around with this, but I think for now that looks pretty good. And then we'll go with our mid-tones. We're going to push those up a little bit. And that's going to add a lot of that brightness back to the deer itself. And we're just going to play around with this too. We get to something we like somewhere around here. Then we have the highlights. And I probably won't do a whole lot with the highlights, but maybe just add a little bit. And you can see right here, if you look, it's just going to add a little bit of the warmth back to it. And then we'll go back to our shadows and just kind of play around with this a little bit. So I think somewhere, not quite that much, somewhere around there looks good. So toggling this on and off, you can see just how much of a difference the tone curve makes. So next we're going to move on to the color panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is just desaturate these greens quite a bit. Somewhere around there, and then I'll pull the hue up a little bit towards the blue side, not a whole lot. And then I want to darken them a little bit, so I'm going to pull down the luminance, and you can see what that does. It's kind of, this darkens it a bit. If you go this way, it'll make them a little bit brighter. So we'll pull these down. I think somewhere around -16 looks pretty good. So next we'll go to the yellows. So I'm going to desaturate the yellow just a little bit and then slide the hue down towards the orange. Somewhere right about there. And then we'll play around with the luminance. And I think I might leave the luminance alone for that one. And then for the blues, if you look in the deer's leg, on all these white parts, there's a little bit of blue in there. It's hard to see, but if you, sorry, that's aqua. But if you slide this hue slider, then you can see how much blue is actually in there. So what I'm gonna do is desaturate this just a little bit. You can see, it might be hard to tell, but you can see there's a little bit of blue in there. I'm just gonna take maybe, I'm just gonna do maybe negative 17 looks pretty good. And then I'll play around with the luminance, probably pull this up to maybe about +7, just to make it pop a little bit. And then that's all I'm gonna do in this color panel. And just toggling that back and forth, you can see that makes quite a bit of difference. So now moving down to color grading. So what I like to do is just pull the saturation down quite a bit, just so I can get a better idea of what color I'm selecting. And so for the shadows, I'm gonna do just a slight blue to the shadows. Maybe somewhere around there looks pretty good. And then I'm gonna slide this saturation slider back till maybe around 5. So you can see the hue is 212, the saturation is 5, and luminance is 0. And then moving on to the midtones, gonna do the same thing. And just kind of slide this around until I get to where I like. So what I'm kind of going for here is a little bit blue in the shadows, and I want to keep the midtones warm. So somewhere around there I think looks really good. And then what we'll do is slide this down until we get to where we like. So I think maybe around 6 looks pretty good. And then same thing with the highlights. I'm gonna keep those pretty warm. Like somewhere around there. And again, I'm gonna slide that saturation back down to maybe about 5. So I think the colors in this image look pretty good straight out the camera. So I'm not gonna do too much color grading. This is all I'm gonna do. But if I toggle it back and forth, you can see, especially down here, it just kind of warms up the grass, warms up the midtones and the deer a little bit. Just adds a little bit to it. So moving on to the details, I do want to add some sharpening, but I also want to keep this image soft. So I'm going to do some heavy masking. So what I'm doing, I'm just grabbing this masking slider and hitting Option on my keyboard. And I'm just going to select to where I get just the outlines of the deer. Somewhere around there looks pretty good. I'm just going to sharpen this to around 60, 70. I feel like it looks pretty good. So if I toggle this on and off, it's kind of hard to see, but if we take a look at, not quite that much. So if you take a look at the deer around the eye and around the ears right here, you can really see how much that sharpening helps. So it looks much better. So moving down to the effects panel, we're just going to give a slight vignette, maybe around -6, -7, because we're going to do a little bit more masking later. And then calibration, I'm not going to touch that right now. I might come back to that later. So moving back to the basic panel, now we can adjust the presence. And the first thing I'm going to do is just up the vibrance just a little bit, maybe around +5 or +6. And what that's going to do is just help these desaturated greens right here pop a little bit. So if you can see, if I just go back and forth, especially if you look right here, just looks a little bit of dull, a little monotone. So we're just gonna move this up a bit, and then just that right there just adds a little bit of pop to the green. So the next thing I wanna do is adjust the clarity. So bringing the clarity down is gonna soften the image, but I don't wanna soften everything. I wanna make sure that I preserve all the details in the deer. So I'm gonna move this back to 0, and I'm gonna create a mask. I'm gonna select a subject, and I'm going to invert it. So this way I have everything selected except for the deer. And then now I can slide this clarity slider a little bit. You don't want to go too crazy with this. -7, -8. I wouldn't go any further than that with this image. I think -7 looks pretty good. And then that looks good there. So the next thing I'm going to do is add a little bit of vignette at the bottom. So I'm going to grab this linear gradient and just drag it up like this. I'll pull it down to where I like, somewhere around there. And then drop the exposure a little bit. So that's just going to darken the foreground a little bit and kind of help your eyes just naturally go towards the deer. And then I'm going to do one more mask, which is going to be a radio gradient. And what this is going to be is I'm going to simulate sunshine. So in this photo, the sun is rising over here on this side. So I want to have a beam of light coming as if the sun was shining on this deer. So I'm just going to position that. And then what I'll do is just bring the exposure up a little bit. And you can see just adds a little bit of brightness. So it just adds a little bit of brightness and kind of makes it look like there's a ray of sunshine hitting this deer. So, and I think that is all we're going to do at masking. You could come back down to effects, and then play around with the vignette a little bit. So I might up that to maybe around 11. And then you can play around with the contrast a little bit. Just kind of tweaking it to your taste, but I think I'm going to bring the contrast down a little bit to around there. And then one of the last things I like to do is if you come to this tab right here in your tone curve, you can kind of fine tune your tone curve a bit. So I might pull these up a little bit, and then the highlights. Maybe about right there. So you can see the tone curve is really where you get the most out of the photo. And then I would kind of just step back and see if there's anything else I would want to do to this photo. And actually, I might just desaturate those yellows just a little bit more. So maybe somewhere around there. So I think that's all I would do to this photo. Just looking at the before and after, you can see it made quite a bit of difference. Yeah, so thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned a little bit. If you did, consider subscribing, hit that like button, and stay tuned because I'm going to try to put these out every Tuesday. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next week.